It is March, which means the madness is almost here. Which teams are going to make it to the Final Four? Which teams are going to be the Cinderella story? Buzzer beaters. And look, free agency starts next week. The NFL draft is still weeks away. You can still get in on the sports action with March Madness, the NBA and NHL. Head over to BetOnline.ag today. BetOnline is today's presenting sponsor of the Bleav in Steelers show. BetOnline, the game starts here. Let's get to today's guest here on Bleav in Steelers. He was at the NFL Combine in Indianapolis. We welcome in Ryan Roberts. And Ryan, you're everywhere right now, a draft analyst for A to Z Sports. And I will say this, I want to start here. You told me several years ago in the immediate aftermath, you tried to warn me about Kenny Pickett. You compared him to Matt Schaub. Here we are years later, and I got to say, you were spot on. You were right. I didn't want to hear it at the time.
Yeah, well, I mean, unfortunately, he might not even be as good as Matt Schaub, which is the unfortunate circumstance. I mean, he is a Super Bowl winning quarterback now, I guess. That we have that with the Philadelphia Eagles this past year. But yeah, I didn't hate the player. I just didn't like the player in the top 20. You know what I mean? Like, that was just kind of what it was for me. I thought that I had a day 2 grade on him, and I was like, this kid, I think, is a serviceable player. I think he's a high-end backup, potentially on the NFL level. Maybe he develops into a starter at some point, but unfortunately, obviously didn't work out with the Steelers. He's still a relatively young cat, though, so let's see if he's able to develop. Still working behind the Philadelphia Eagles. Not really sure what the outlook is long-term, but, unfortunately, I guess Steelers are still in the quarterback conversation now, years later, on what they're going to do next.
Yeah, we'll get into that here in a second. Did you make it to St. Elmo's in Indy this past weekend?
Funny enough, Mark, I have been to the Combine now. I think this is my 5th or 6th one, and I had never been to St. Elmo's until this year. So it's made to St. Elmo's, got some very good sirloin steak and all the fixings there. So it was it lived up to the hype, to say the least. It was quite good.
Yeah, I'm assuming you tried the shrimp cocktail as well.
I didn't. I'm actually not a big shrimp guy. A couple of my buddies there, I think we had a group of 6. They ate the shrimp cocktail. I saw their heads explode a little bit from the heat and all that type of stuff. Snot coming out a little bit, but no, I'm not really a shrimp guy, and I'm definitely not a horseradish guy. So the fact that there's like horseradish mixed in there, that's not really my jam, but they liked it. They seemed to like it, which is always good. So
I had warning when I was there a year ago, so it was like, hey, I knew what to expect. Just be weird when you go to a steakhouse where it's like, no, I don't want water. I need milk to help dissipate the heat. Now, I will say this about the shrimp cocktail there. That heat, it hits you hard for about 2 or 3 seconds and it dissipates pretty quickly. But, man, that is no joke. That is no joke.
Yeah, well, some of my one of my buddies got peer pressured into it, right? Like he admittedly is not he's not a spicy guy at all, but we were at St. Elmo's. He felt the peer pressure. I got to eat the shrimp cocktail. I got to eat the cocktail sauce, all that type of stuff. Mm-hmm. So he gave it a shot. He liked it though, which was cool. But again, like you could see the sweat coming off his brow there for like 3 or 4 seconds.
I'm glad to say I've had it. I didn't need to have it at any other point during the weekend, and I can say that I survived it. But yeah. Let's start here in Indy, and we can get into the Steelers' needs, but is there a player or group of players when you think back to the 2025 NFL Combine, who are the biggest standouts from this past weekend?
Yeah, I think that when you talk about the biggest standouts, you're going to talk about like the guys that just kind of captivated us from the freaky athleticism that they were able to put together, right? Like I think of guys immediately like Shamar Stewart, a defensive end from Texas A&M. And this isn't obviously Steelers centric, right? This is just more like the main standouts there, but he was one. Jahad Campbell, the linebacker from Alabama, I thought showcased himself in a great way. There were a few different wide receivers. I mean, it's hard to ignore what Matthew Golden did running 4.29 out of Texas. So there were guys across the board though, man. Like it was kind of I don't want to say disappointing, right? Because I just know where the combine's trending a little bit with the GPS data and that type of stuff. But less guys are starting to participate, which is unfortunate, right? So like we didn't see like Tyler Warren participate. We didn't see Shedeur Sanders or Cam Ward throw the football around as the top quarterbacks in this class. But that's just kind of becoming the running trend here with just kind of more data being available. But I think Shamar Stewart, Jahad Campbell, Matthew Golden, like those are a few guys that kind of really caught the attention from like the athleticism that they were able to showcase in Indy.
All right, let's start with the receivers. That's fine with me. To me, it seemed like the two Texas guys, Golden and Bond, did like a body switch this past weekend.
That's so funny, dude. I mean, literally, people had asked coming up to, the events, you're predicting who are going to be the fastest guys, right? And on the short list at wide receiver, it was Isaiah Bonds from Texas. It was going to be Arian Smith from Georgia. Like, those were a couple of the guys you're like, those guys can go, right? Like, so they're going to be guys that are, and I don't say it's annoying, but you talked to Isaiah Bond at his media availability before he tested the day before, and he's talking about, I'm going to run 4.2 flat or better, right? Like, he was talking about he was going to run the 4.1s. And then it's so funny because he runs 4.39, which is in all levels a really good time, right? Like 4.39 is flying, but everyone was so disappointed because you can't predict you're going to run 4.19 and then run 4.39. Like, that's just not how that works. But then it's so weird to see Matthew Golden being the 4.29 guy at the combine because, to be very honest and transparent, I don't see that on film for Matthew Golden. Like, I think Matthew Golden's a really good wide receiver. I think he's technically refined. I think he's got really good hands. I think he's super smooth. Like, quickness is really good. But 4.29, like, if you would have told me he ran 4.49, I'd be like, yep, that sounds about right. So we're going to have a really interesting conversation here just as a collective with Matthew Golden, because while I really like Matthew Golden, I think he'll be a dang good NFL wide receiver. If you're drafting him to be deep threat 4.29 Matthew Golden, I think you're going to be a little bit disappointed, man, because I actually don't think that that's a huge part of his game, despite what the time says in Indy.
Yeah, the game speed, I heard a lot of people who were like, we don't know about his straight line speed, and he obviously ran the fastest 40 of any of the receivers. Who is the receiver in the gauntlet drill that you thought looked the smoothest? Because I look back at that of the past 2 years. 2 years ago, it was Puka Nacua who had the fastest of any of the receivers. And then this past year, Keon Coleman out of Florida State, who went to the Bills, a lot of people saw his 4.6 40. And it's like, I know he's a contested go up and get it guy, but he was flying through the gauntlet. I'm like, hey, with the ball in his hands, he'll be fine. Who looked good at the receiver position in the gauntlet drill? Because I think that's actually a better indicator of on-field success versus running a 40 on wind.
Yeah, I think Jayden Higgins from Iowa State's the first guy that popped into my mind. He is almost 6'4" verified. He's 210. I think he weighed in at like 213, 212, somewhere in that ballpark. So he's a bigger body. He actually tested better than I thought he was going to be too. I thought he was going to be like a mid 4.5s guy, but he ran like 4.47, which is a really good time for his body type and his play style. But if you're talking about just the gauntlet, like what straight down the line, was super collected, turning, flipping his head and snatching outside of his frame and didn't have to decelerate a lot, that's like the big thing you want to see at that drill is like you want to see controlled and you want to see a guy that is comfortable and doesn't have to decelerate for a pass, kind of, breaking momentum, that type of stuff. So I thought Jayden Higgins, big body, just super comfortable running the gauntlet. He was one of the guys that if we just had to talk about like one of the big risers in this class, because he had a really good Senior Bowl as well. He had a great last final year at Iowa State. There's actually two really good Iowa State wide receivers in this class, which is kind of funny to say. You like your occasional Alan Lazard that came out of Iowa State a few years ago, but you don't ever get two of them in the same class. You know what I mean? So Jayden Higgins, big body, tested better than he thought. And I thought he looked really good throughout the drills, but including the gauntlet as well.
Yeah. Pittsburgh needs a receiver. I was telling your colleague, Joe DeLeon, where it's just like, we've got George Pickens and everybody else here in Pittsburgh. Pickens is entering a contract season. I know that this receiver class isn't as deep as it was a year ago, though. So maybe you go earlier on because there could be a run on receivers. And then when you get into the second and third rounds and beyond that, it's like, there's not what you need to be there. Whereas my understanding is like the positions of depth this year are running back and then defensive tackle. If I'm totally off base, hop in here. But I know Pittsburgh needs a receiver desperately. And not just to compliment George Pickens. Look, the only two other guys under contract, you got Calvin Austin III and then Roman Wilson, who barely played as a rookie due to injury. So Pittsburgh needs help there. And look, I know we might know more a week from today when free agency officially starts, but that is a desperate position of need, not just for the season, but if you lose George Pickens beyond this year and he goes and tests free agency, you're going to need somebody on this offense. I got one more thing, too. When I talk about blue chip offensive players, the Pittsburgh Steelers have not had a first-team all-pro offensive player since 2017. They had AB, Le'Veon Bell, and I can't remember if it was Pouncey or DeCastro up front. But you're going on 10 years since you had a first-team all-pro player. That's got to change if you want to have success in the league. Take that in any direction in terms of other receivers the Steelers could target in the draft or free agency.
Yeah, no, and that's a very crazy stat. Like some of these stats now that you're kind of coming across are pretty wild, but that's definitely one because I feel like the Steelers, you can always depend on them having a really good defense, right? But getting that offense back to the structure that you need to be a complementary, offense to defense perspective is very important. But wide receiver, I think this class, it's unfortunate, Mark, because the last 5 years we've had 4 elite classes of wide receivers, right? So we got a little bit spoiled as far as every year it was just these crazy wide receiver classes. This one is average to slightly below average is kind of how I would state it, right? It's not a bad class by any stretch, but it's not as sexy. You're not going to get there's no Jamar Chase in this class. There just isn't. There isn't that type of dude. But I think where Steelers are positioned, there are a couple interesting wide receivers that could be on the board. And I think the one that I've mocked several times as Steelers, and I just love the thought of it, is Emeka Egbuka from Ohio State. That's my guy in this class because Pickens is that big-bodied, outside receiver, going to win one-on-ones. He's that type of dude, right? Steelers need someone that can line up a little bit more inside and out, and a guy that can be a really easy target for a quarterback, right? So I'm talking about these pure slot Z types that can motion inside, that can move around a little bit, but more often than anything, inviting targets to the middle of the field, right? Short to intermediates, make it easy for a quarterback. That's Emeka Egbuka. If Emeka Egbuka didn't get hurt during the 2023 season, we're probably not even having this conversation because he probably would have been in the 2024 NFL draft, but he got injured and he only had 500-something yards because of it. But then he comes back, 80-something catches, over 1,000 yards for the national champs. He is the easiest wide receiver projection, I think, in this class in sense of I think the floor is so high, right? So high. I think there's with Tedrow and McMillan, who's probably going to be off the board anyway out of Arizona. He is a little bit more volatile in the sense of his ceiling is probably a little bit higher than Egbuka's, but I think the floor is lower. So you're talking, I don't want to call him a pure boomer bust guy, but the ceiling and the floor is definitely a little bit more of a chasm. For Egbuka, I'd be shocked if he wasn't a just perennial 700-800 yard at worst wide receiver in the NFL, but I wouldn't be shocked at all too if he's just 9, 1,000, 1,100, somewhere in that ballpark. I don't see much bust factor there. He runs clean routes. He understands spacing. He catches the football consistently, and he's better after the catch than maybe some people are going to give him credit for too. He can do that work after the catch. So as a inside receiver, yak guy who runs good routes and can do the screen game and can do short to intermediate and can run an advanced route tree, Emeka Egbuka is an easy one in this class. So if he's there for the Steelers, I wouldn't even think about it. I just run to the podium and Emeka Egbuka, make him the pick. Otherwise, there's a possibility that a Luther Burden from Missouri could be there. He might be a little bit earlier. He might not be. I mean, we just had 2 mock drafts from 2 very prominent NFL draft analysts today that had actually Luther Burden falling out of the first round. So there's a possibility that he could slide a little bit in this class. But he's another guy a little bit different than Egbuka. His routes aren't quite as tight. He's not quite as consistent, but the dude has juice after the catch, screen game, shorts, yak guy. He reminds me a lot of Golden Tate's for a body type perspective. He's 206 pounds. He can break through arm tackles. He's kind of that RPO screen game type of guy as well. So if there's a Emeka Egbuka or Luther Burden on the board for the Steelers, I think in the first round, I think that would be very good possibility and a good opportunity to upgrade that wide receiver room outside of Pickens.
Yeah, let's talk about Egbuka a little bit. We'll get to Burden.
Yeah.
How is he different from other Ohio State receivers that you've scouted through the past few years? Because Ohio State's been wide receiver U. It's been then Alabama and LSU. But how is Egbuka different than the other Ohio State receivers that have been drafted over the last few years?
Yeah, it's a great question. I think when you're talking about a Marvin Harrison Jr., for instance, right? That's a pure outside receiver. You would couple Emeka Egbuka comparatively for Ohio State receivers with like Jackson Smith and Jigba is a guy that is the most similar, I would say. Their body types are a little different. Egbuka's a little bit thicker, right? Like he's a little bit of a bigger slot comparative to Jackson Smith and Jigba. But he's a guy that I think is going to do his best on the inside. So like when I think of like Garrett Wilson was an outside in guy, right? Like he can move around a little bit. Chris Olave was like a pure Z. He's going to play outside to the field, and he's going to be a route runner and a separator, like that type of thing. I think Jackson Smith and Jigba and Emeka Egbuka are the two guys from Ohio State that have come out over the last few years that are like those true slot types, right? Like understanding how to create spacing, understand how to manipulate defenders, how to find soft spots and zones. Like that's the type of guy that Emeka Egbuka is, but they're just winning a little bit of a different way. Jackson Smith and Jigba was more about understanding spacing, while Emeka Egbuka is about route running and getting in and out of breaks clean and after the catch a little bit. So I would say that he is a little bit similar as far as the role that he's going to play to a Jackson Smith and Jigba, but I just think he wins in a little bit of some different ways.
Yeah. It's a position where after the trade of Deontay Johnson, and he was on 14s in a calendar year, Pittsburgh just never replaced that production. So you mentioned Luther Burden III. So I'm very familiar with Ryan. I'm a University of Missouri alum. So the last 2 years on 3rd and 4th down conversions, when Missouri needed to move the chains, this is the guy that the team went to. I know Schrader in the backfield had a very good year on the ground. He's on the Rams now. But when you needed 3rd down and long, 4th down and long, Burden was consistently the guy that quarterback Brady Cook went to. How that translates over to the pros, we'll see. But I thought he tested very well in Indy. I thought he looked very fluid, ran a good 40. And it's a player where you mentioned Golden Tate, another player. I've heard Golden Tate as a comp. I've also heard Deebo Samuel as a comp for Luther Burden III.
Yeah, it's the after catch ability that they have, right? Like Luther Burden, it should be no shock that we're talking about him as an NFL draft prospect because he was a former 5-star, obviously, and he was very productive. You know, after kind of a little bit more of like a gadget return man his first year at Missouri, he was dominant in year 2, had over 1,000 yards, and you were just kind of penciling it in this past offseason of like, hey, Luther Burden's going to have a similar year. He's going to go in the top 10 to 15, and that's going to be the story. Like, that's just going to be it. Unfortunately, his production was down this year. Part of it was due to him being a little bit banged up at different points of the season. Part of it was the offensive line for Missouri was worse than the year prior, so there was less time to throw. And it was just the offense stagnated a little bit this past year compared to 2023, where it was a very, very good offense, out there in Missouri. So we saw a little bit of a step back here from production, but I also don't think after watching Luther Burden's film, like I don't think he became a less good football player. Like I still think he was a really good player. I just think there was a lot of things going around that kind of prevented that great production. But like I said, he's right around 6 foot, 206 pounds. He's densely built. He's got kind of that running back frame to him where you're going to throw RPO game to him. You're going to throw screen game, and you're going to ask him to break tackles and be explosive in the open fields. He is a friendly wide receiver for a quarterback because he creates so much after the catch. It makes a quarterback's job very easily, right? Like you throw a ball to him and it's only a 4-yard route, and then he breaks a tackle and he turns it into 12 yards. Well, it looks like a 12-yard completion for the quarterback, when in reality, he only threw the ball 4 yards. You know what I mean? So like that is very, very quarterback friendly. So Luther Burden is kind of that modern age yak slot type, a guy that you can also run some jet sweeps with, end arounds. You can be creative with him and you can be explosive with him. And the one thing I love about him, which is why I still think there's a little bit more upside than just kind of this gadget slot type that people are going to phrase him as, I just think he's pretty competitive at the catch point for his size. Like that's not going to be his game necessarily because he's not the biggest wide receiver of all time as far as height and just length. But he is competitive. He is physical, which is why I think that the Golden Tate comp is something that kind of comes to my mind really quickly because, yes, you can say he's a yak slot type, but Golden Tate was pretty physical, for his size. He would fight and he would go up the ladder. He would fight for contested catches at times. And I think that's something that Luther Burden also has in common with him.
Yeah, I look at how Missouri paired him with Theo Weiss, who was a 5-star recruit, a transfer out of Oklahoma, big-bodied receiver. I want all the different cars in my garage when it comes to the receiver position. The Steelers can potentially do that, whether it's the first or second round. So if the Steelers don't go with the receiver at 21, is there another position where you like them to draft. And I mean, the needs here are defensive tackle, potentially cornerback. I am not as keen on drafting a running back in the first round, just given the positional value. But of those other positions, if it's not a receiver at 21, which position do you like? Are there players that you like that would be a good fit for the Pittsburgh Steelers?
I think interior defensive line is really interesting because I like Keanu Benton a lot. I know he's been good when he's been healthy for the Steelers, obviously. Cam Hayward is a fantastic player, but Cam Hayward obviously is on the second half of his career, right? So it started to trend downward a little bit, and he's, he only has a couple years left, if that. So he's trending on the downslope there. I think a couple guys that could be there that are super interesting and for different reasons because we're replacing multiple roles here. There's a young man out of Michigan named Kenneth Grant, who's this big body, 340-pound, massive nose. Keanu Benton, I know, does a lot of the dirty work for Pittsburgh inside, but I'm imagining a world where I could actually let Keanu move around a little bit more because I do think there's some untapped athleticism and potential there to be a little bit more of a penetrator from his sense. And unfortunately, Kenneth Grant wasn't able to test because he had a little bit of a pulled hammy and a little bit of a hamstring issue. But if he would have been able to test, I mean, people were predicting he was going to run 4.8 something at 340 pounds. Like he would have tested similarly like Terry Poe did coming out of Memphis a few years ago with, I guess not a few years ago, that's probably like 10 plus years ago at this point, but freaking nature athlete, man, that can really do a lot of incredible things on the interior. Derrick Harmon's another guy out of Oregon that I think is super interesting. He's a little more of like a versatile movement player. Like he could play some zero, like nose, but you can also move him out to 3. You can play 4-4-I. So if you're a team that wants to run multiple fronts, if you're not just exclusive 4 or 3-man front, I think that Derrick Harmon has had experience playing everywhere up front. So he's kind of a gap penetrator. And if you do like corner, to go somebody opposite Joey Porter Jr., I think there are going to be several guys that could potentially be on the board. I mean, at that point in the drafts, because if we're looking at the easy ones are obviously up top 10 most likely. Travis Hunter will go top 5 more than likely. You're going to have Will Johnson. But then after that, it's like Siobhan Revell is a guy that I really like out of ECU. He's kind of a long, explosive athlete that can turn a run with just about everybody. There's going to be options for short cornerback in that spot, but I think that the good thing about those needs for Pittsburgh, though, Mark, in my opinion, is both interior defense line and cornerback. That's 2 of the deeper positions in the draft. So, like, if you wanted to go wide receiver and make sure that you have a guy to go along with George Pickens, you can find guys in the 2nd, 3rd round, or maybe even the 4th into day 3 there that you can find contribution from both corner and defensive tackle, which I think does align well with what the Steelers' needs are in this draft.
All right, Kenneth Grant, like, this isn't an exact player comp, but it's like what Casey Hampton was to this defense for years for Pittsburgh.
Same role. Yeah.
Mm-hmm. A-gap, B-gap, you're going to be either directly over the center, maybe in a one technique, and you're going to absolutely dominate A-gap, B-gap. And to me, that's so important to this defense because we mentioned Cam Hayward at 36 on the back half of his career. The analogy I've been making, I'm a broken record saying this. It's like when you go to the fridge and you check the milk and it's either at or nearing your expiration date. And it still smells good. It's still good for right now. But how much longer you can keep relying on that. Exactly. And so how you replace that player, you mentioned Harmon out of Oregon. I think you could move him around a little bit, would also allow you to move around Keanu Benton a little bit. If they go with Grant, they can then kick out Benton to the defensive end position in a 3-4 defense where you got the defensive end who's almost more like a defensive tackle because you've got 4 linebackers, 2 outside linebackers. So I see Grant, and if he's there, that's going to be awfully tough to pass on. And I mean, if it's Grant, one of the 2 receivers we mentioned, it's kind of it's a luxury of riches. And then maybe potentially, if there's another team that needs, say, I look at the positions that aren't as deep, like say offensive tackle, and there's a guy still on the board at that point, maybe Pittsburgh could trade out of 21 and trade back and end up getting 2 of the guys that they would have normally in that grade similarly. Just given the positional value that they have at 21. But you mentioned Grant. Harmon out of Oregon, I know they met with at the combine as well. And I think he has a little bit more versatility, a bit lighter than Grant. I think you could move him around to say you could either put him either at a pure nose or at one of those defensive end positions in the 3-4 defense. But Again, I'd be fine. I'll end here. I think I'd be okay if the Steelers either approach free agency or if they double dip and get 2 defensive tackles just to get more depth. Because, again, I want Cam Hayward to have like a country club style training camp because, again, he's in the back half of his career.
Well, and this is obviously more for the long term versus the short term, but I think Derrick Harmon would also be a perfect guy to learn under Cam Hayward, right? Because like when I think of Cam Hayward, Cam is super versatile, right? Like he can attack from multiple alignments, and he always has been. I even think back to when he was at Ohio State. I think he originally started his career as a true defensive end at Ohio State before kind of transitioning a little bit to more of an exclusive interior player. So this is a guy that can play just about anywhere. Derrick Harmon actually spent the majority of his career with the Michigan State program. And when he was at Michigan State, he was a true nose, and he was about 330-something pounds. When he got to Oregon, he lost about 10 to 15, and he became just a much more gap penetration style player. So having that versatility, the movement, and I mean, he just tested very well at the combine. So we kind of illustrated the type of athleticism he has. So I think not only would he be able to help you short term on the interior, along with guys like Keanu Benton and Cam Hayward, I also think learning from someone like Hayward would be instrumental for the long term of his career as well.
Absolutely. So we got to talk some quarterbacks because at the time of this recording, and I'm cursing myself with the podcast here, Skylar Thompson's the only quarterback under a contract for the Pittsburgh Steelers. I think that the Steelers will end up re-signing Justin Fields. If not Fields, perhaps Russell Wilson. My prediction is that Russell Wilson ends up with the New York Giants. We'll see how all of that shakes out. Having said all of that, I know free agency is right around the corner, but is there a quarterback in day 2, day 3 that you could see as a potential fit for the Pittsburgh Steelers? I don't think that quarterback's there on day 1 at 21. I know Jackson Dart's getting some love, but I don't see him as a first rounder. Is there a guy where you would see, hey, that could potentially be a fit for the Steelers again, day 2, day 3 of the draft at the quarterback position?
It's funny that you ask. I actually put out at A to Z Sports yesterday an intel piece and just some things I was hearing in Indianapolis that I kind of think had some legs to it a little bit, right? Some of the rumors that I actually kind of buy a little bit. And it was actually about the Steelers. And some things that I had heard was they're interested in bringing one of the 2 gentlemen that you talked about back, whether that is Russell Wilson or Justin Fields. And then they would be more in the day 2 conversation. And I just don't buy the day 1 quarterback conversation that's going to continue with the Steelers. I understand why it's there because, like you said, as of now, there's no answer on quarterback on the roster, right? So, like, you need to figure out something. But I don't buy it at, in the 20s as far as them taking a quarterback right now. The one guy that I had heard that the Steelers do like a good bit is Will Howard out of Ohio State. And when I say that, I'm talking most people are estimating him more in the 3rd to 4th round conversation. So we're not talking like early day 2 investment, most likely. He is from Pennsylvania. So that's an easy, conversation point of kind of the, him being a guy that's in that realm and being a guy that could come back home, a little bit of a good story, I guess, even though I know he's not from Pittsburgh. He's a little bit more, I think he's from Downingtown, PA, which is more like in the Philadelphia area. So he's actually not even close to Pittsburgh. But regardless, that was a guy that I had heard kind of phrase with the Steelers a little bit, a guy that they might have some interest in somewhere in potentially 3rd to 4th rounds.
Yeah, Downingtown, Pennsylvania. That's spot on. Was it as bad from afar on TV? He missed a lot of throws. I know he might not be familiar with the receivers. Maybe the receivers are running wrong routes. It seemed like both Howard and then Gabriel really, really struggled. What was that like in person versus what I watched on television?
It was as bad as you saw it on TV. It was really bad. Will Howard and Dylan Gabriel both were awful in the throwing session. Like there's no nice way to put it, right? Like they really struggled. And I am sympathetic to I've never thrown to these guys before. I don't have the timing down with them 100%. But on particular routes, you're just trying to hit spots, right? And I think the spots were really off on Will Howard. So I think it's an interesting conversation because it's not like a make or break thing, right? Like we're talking about the whole draft process is a resume process, right? Like the last year of film is the biggest part of your resume. But then as we kind of work down the resume, here's the combine, here's the medicals, here's the meetings, here's all that type of stuff together. So it's not the end all be all, but like to answer your question as directly as I can, It wasn't great, Mark. It was not a great showing throwing the football from Will Howard or Dylan Gabriel out.
It's like I was even wondering, I remember, like, are they doing a 7-on-7 or is there a pass rush I'm unaware of? It was just like there were a few throws where it's just like airmail. It was like, whoa, like
There was a lot of issues with timing, and those were the two easiest guys to point to. But some other quarterbacks were throwing like speed outs, and they were throwing way too far inside because the ball just wasn't coming out on time. So, yeah, it was the unfortunate part of like Will Howard, for instance, was like it didn't get much better throughout. Like usually the first couple throws for most guys are a little bit off because you're trying to get back into rhythm and all that type of stuff. But yeah, man, if that was your first time viewing Will Howard as a fan and just the draft, as a draft prospect, then you probably don't think very highly of him. So,
yeah, I do think that, look, if I'm Pittsburgh, you get as many cracks at bat as possible. And just because you miss on Kenny Pickett a few years ago, next at bat. So if I'm Pittsburgh, mid to late rounds, I'd probably pick a quarterback to back up whoever your starter's going to be this season. And then I start stockpiling assets. And what I tell you, Ryan, is this. Arch Manning, I'm a men's medium. The draft is in Pittsburgh next year. Let's start stockpiling the assets now to be able to make moves to get the quarterback of the future, which I don't think is going to happen this offseason for Pittsburgh. It's just not there drafting 21, this quarterback class, this free agent class. That's my plan if I'm in charge of the Steelers front office.
And we see eye to eye on that. I was just going to say that I think that forcing a quarterback at 21 would be a very bad decision. Like it would just be a very bad decision because you're also not going to have. Look, Cam Ward's probably going to go first overall to whoever ends up picking first overall. Like that's my prediction. I don't know if it'll be Tennessee or not, but it's going to be somebody at 1, and I think it's going to be Cam Ward. After that, someone's going to take a chance on Shedeur Sanders in the top 10. I still think, right? But are you willing to draft Jackson Dart 21 overall? Are you willing to draft Jalen Milroe 21 overall? Like, so I mean, those would be the only guys that you can even try to convince yourself into at 21. After that, like, I'd be willing to draft somewhere early to mid day 3, Tyler Shuck out of Louisville, even though he's a little bit of an older prospect. I do like a lot of the things that he brings to the table. But after that, it's just like, don't talk yourself into something that you're not sure about, I guess is the phrase I would kind of lean into here, right? 21 overall, you can get a heck of a football player. After that, you can figure out the quarterback position. But I do think short term, we're talking about the veteran market, and then you just try to find a mid-round asset to be able to groom behind either a Russell Wilson or a Justin Fields.
Yeah, so where I'm at, it's like Cam Ward's top, Shedeur Sanders is right behind, but behind. I put Jackson Dart behind Sanders. Who is like 4 and 5, I guess, for you? Who are the next prospects? And even if you have to list a few, like those to me are the clear top 3, and then there's a drop off from there. But what say you?
Yeah, I mean, so obviously after Darts, you'll be talking about Jalen Milroe, like I said, from Alabama, who's a complete reclamation project. Great athlete, strong arm, but he's a long way away from being an NFL quarterback right now. Tyler Shuck, I mentioned out of Louisville, is an interesting player. You're talking about the areas of like the Will Howards from Ohio State that we talked about a little bit. You're talking about Kyle McCord out of Syracuse, who was originally of Ohio State. You're talking about Riley Leonard out of Notre Dame, who's a little bit more of an athlete, but not really the passer that you want. Dylan Gabriel out of Oregon. Like there's a bunch of names, but there's not a lot of excitement behind those names. You know what I mean? Like I could see several of those guys end up being good backups, maybe into high-end backups. But if we're talking about potential starting quarterbacks, outside of the top 2 names, I think that you're hopeful, but you're not enthused by drafting one of those guys to be a starter in the immediate future.
Reminds me a little bit of the 2022 class.
Yeah, well,
a little bit.
The depth is similar to the 2022 class because, like I said, there's names and like. People clown like Desmond Ridder and what happened with the Falcons, but like they didn't invest a high pick in Desmond Ridder. It was fine. They wanted to move off of Desmond Ridder immediately, and they moved off him because they don't have a lot of money that was put into Desmond Ridder, right? Like he was a mid day 2 player at that point, right? Like Malik Willis was a 3rd round pick. Like all these guys, there was quality to be found, but just we were trying to push guys up the board. I think the good thing about this class compared to the 2022 is like Cam Ward in most years would be a 1st round pick. Like he would be. Would he be the number 1 overall pick? No. But would he still be in the 1st round conversation? Yes. So I think there is a true first round quarterback in this class overall. And then you have Shedeur obviously in that conversation as well. So the top's a little bit better than 2022. But like after that, yes, feels very, very much like the 2022 quarterback class.
All right, Ryan, if you need to plug anything you're doing over at A to Z Sports, the floor is yours.
Yeah. Like I said, I just put out a little bit of a combine intel piece at A to Z Sports. I'm going to be working NFL draft, college football, the rest of the off season now, getting you guys ready for April. I'm at Rise and Draft on Twitter. So if you just want to follow along there, I tweet out every one of my links, whether it's podcast centric. You can go to A to Z Film Room on YouTube as well, if you guys like some video analysis and all that good stuff. But yep, A to Z Sports, NFL draft, college football, NFL, anything you guys need there. It's a little bit of a one-stop shop.
Ryan Roberts, I thank you for your time. And let me wrap this up here. If you enjoyed listening to Bleav in Steelers, 5 stars only on Apple and Spotify. I want to thank today's presenting sponsor, BetOnline.ag. And also, if you haven't already, hit the subscribe button on the Mark Bergin YouTube page. Double R, thank you for your time. I appreciate it, man. And we'll reconnect as we get closer to April's draft.
Absolutely. Thank you, Mark.
He's Ryan Roberts. I'm Mark Bergin. Thanks for listening to Bleav in Steelers. I'll see you next time. Until then, take care. So long, everybody.